Jesus is transfigured. In chapter 9 and verse 2 now, after 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John and led them up on a high mountain apart by themselves, and he was transfigured before them. Because he's just been in the area of Caesarea Philippi to the north of the Sea of Galilee, one assumes that he's still perhaps in this area. There's been no change of geography as far as what Mark has told us. So the mountain that's close to this area, the very high mountain, about 9,000 feet tall, that's close to this area is Mount Hermon. It would not have been a very far hike from Caesarea Philippi to there. And so we could picture Jesus going up on Mount Hermon with these three disciples that he's chosen and being transfigured before them. It must have been an amazing sight. The text tells us in Mark chapter 9 and verse 3 that his clothes became shining, exceeding white, like snow, such as no launderer on earth can whiten them. I don't suppose Hollywood special effects could have done any greater at all by any means than what happened in the sight of Peter, James, and John on this occasion. Jesus becomes just glowing and glistening in a white garment and just shimmering, if you will, I think, in their eyes. And it was most impressive to them. But besides that, the text also says that Elijah appeared to them with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. Now, those familiar with the Old Testament will realize that Moses and Elijah are two great characters in the Old Testament. Moses is the chief lawgiver of the Old Testament, and Elijah is one of the greatest, if not perhaps the greatest, prophets of the Old Testament. So here you have represented in these two men the law and the prophets of the Old Testament. And they're talking with Jesus. Luke's account of this in Luke chapter 9 and verse 31 even tells us what they were talking about. They were talking about Jesus' impending decease, that he was going to die in the not too distant future. You might remember, again, that this is what Jesus had been talking to Peter about just a little bit earlier, within 6 days earlier than this. He'd been telling Peter and their other apostles that he was going to die. Peter had rebuked him for that. Jesus said, no, get behind me, get focused on spiritual things. So now he's transfigured before Peter, James, and John. Peter's included in this. He's transfigured before them. And Elijah and Moses are standing there talking with him about his imminent death. Surely that has now an impression on Peter. And you'd think he'd begin to see things more clearly than before. But in fear and awe, Peter suggests building a tabernacle for each of the three. A tabernacle would be a tent or a dwelling place. The Israelites used such a structure in the Old Testament to worship God for over 300 years. And Peter's suggesting here we can build a dwelling place for you and Moses and Elijah. And perhaps his idea was we will worship you all and honor you all. But in Mark chapter 9 and verse 5, even as Peter is saying this, the description is in verse 6, he did not know what to say because they were greatly afraid. And then in verse 7, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and a voice came out of the cloud saying, "This is my beloved Son, hear him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one anymore, but only Jesus with themselves. What's the lesson? What is God the Father in heaven teaching these three men and all of us by this demonstration? It's time to listen to my Son, is what he's saying. It's time to listen to Jesus, my Son. Hear him. We're not listening to Moses and Elijah. They're not the authority anymore. They're not speaking for me anymore, God's saying in essence. Jesus is. The Hebrew writer in the book of Hebrews says in chapter 1 and verse 1 that God at various times in different ways spoken to the fathers by the prophets has in these last days spoken to us by his Son. God has spoken to us by Jesus Christ, and he's the one that we need to be listening to. We cannot build multiple tabernacles, one for Jesus, one for Moses, one for Elijah, one for the Old Testament, one for our parents, one for our family religion, one for our favorite activity. We can't have multiple tabernacles. Jesus is the one that we need to be following in our lives and focusing on in our lives. Peter needed to see this. He needed to have his perception, his eyesight altered so that he could clearly see that Jesus was truly God's Son, the one to be listened to, the one to be followed all the way to the cross and beyond. So I think Peter begins perhaps to get an inkling of, even more so, of who Jesus is, as he's already confessed him as being the Christ, the Son of God. But Jesus, as they go on, we pick up the reading in Mark chapter 9 and verse 9, they come down from the mountain, and he commands them that they should tell no one the things that they had seen till the Son of Man had been risen from the dead. This event, as I've already indicated, makes a huge impression on Peter. In fact, later on, of course, Peter writes by inspiration 2 epistles of the New Testament. And much later in his life, he writes this epistle of 2 Peter. And I want to read 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 14 and following, where Peter refers back to this event. He says, now he's getting close to the end of his life. This is 2 Peter 1. I'll start in verse 14. Knowing that shortly I must put off my tent. That's an interesting word. He said he was going to build tents for Jesus and Elijah and Moses. Peter now realizes he's going to put off his own tent. That is, he's going to leave this life, just as our Lord Jesus Christ showed me. He says, moreover, I will be careful to ensure that you always have a reminder of these things after my decease. For we did not follow cunningly devised fables when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but were eyewitnesses of his majesty. Well, Peter, when did you ever see the majesty of Jesus? Here's what he says in verse 17. For he received from God the Father honor and glory when such a voice came to him from the excellent glory, this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. And we heard this voice which came from heaven when we were with him on the holy mountain. This event that we just read in the Gospel of Mark impresses Peter for the rest of his life. Peter could have pointed to a lot of miracles, a lot of things that he saw Jesus do in his life that really convinced him of who Jesus was. But the one thing that he points to out of all the things Jesus does, healing lepers, raising the dead, healing the blind as he's done just previously here, out of all the things that Jesus did, Peter points to this event on this high mountain where Jesus is transfigured. Jesus tells them not to tell anybody about it until after he's risen from the dead. But I imagine after he's risen from the dead, Peter likes to tell this story. It's an impressive one. In response to a question from the 3 disciples as they're apparently going now on their way, the text tells us that they ask him, saying, "Why do the scribes say that Elijah must come first?" He answered and told them, "Indeed, Elijah is coming first and restores all things. And how is it written concerning the Son of Man that he must suffer many things and be treated with contempt? But I say to you that Elijah has also come, and they did to him whatever they wished, as it is written." Elijah, Jesus says, first of all, has come. In Matthew's account of this, Matthew explains that they understood that he was speaking of John the Baptist. John the Baptist was the Elijah to come. But then Jesus asked them a rhetorical question, which he's so good at. He asked them, why is it written that the Son of Man is to suffer and be treated with contempt? You might remember Jesus had been, again, telling them that's what's going to happen to him. In the Old Testament, you have prophecies concerning the Son of Man. Daniel, for instance, prophesies concerning the coming of the Son of Man. Jesus is that Son of Man that's prophesied of in the Old Testament. It prophesied that the Son of Man would suffer. Jesus is that Christ to come, who the Old Testament prophesies about. Jesus again is trying to get Peter and the others to see that he must go through this suffering and rise from the dead. The disciples don't understand what rising from the dead even means hardly at this point, as it indicates in verse 10. But Jesus is trying to clarify their thinking and focus their eyesight, their spiritual eyesight, so that they might see exactly who he is, but more importantly, what he's going to do and what they need to follow him to do.